Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. It's a joy to join you in this live stream on the question of the existence of God with reference to the work of Thomas Aquinas and Edith Stein. This always is a fascinating question every time it doesn't get old because of its subject matter. God, whatever we mean by God, all that we mean by God, beginning with philosophy. So for Thomas Aquinas, the question of the existence of God is what he calls a preamble of faith, something that is necessary to deal with before we can advance into the content of what's called divine revelation, how God communicates God's self to creatures. So it's a fascinating question. I love it so much every time getting a chance to ask it, to think through it. And above all, my hope in this is when we come back to these metaphysical questions of being, and especially above all, what is being? I ask with Paul Ricoeur, let being be thought in me. Let being be thought in me. There's a difference between approaching the question of being, making it what I want it to be, overriding the question with my intentionality that phenomenology would think about, um, or coming at the question in a much more intuitive way, letting the intuitions of being give themselves to consciousness. So let being be thought in me. In this video, I hope to go through Thomas Aquinas, his 5 ways for knowing about the existence of God, some call the 5 proofs, proofs from the effects that point to the cause that God is. And thinking about this with Thomas Aquinas, hopefully toward the end with some reference to Edith Stein and her work that brings together closely phenomenology and classical metaphysics. So by definition, God is not an object among objects, a quantum among quanta, or even a being among beings. For classical metaphysics, the concept of divinity signifies not a being. So when we ask, does God exist? It's not asking the question, does God as a nominal, like a noun, a being, exist? Instead, it's something quite different. We're asking about being itself and the nature of being itself. So God does exist automatically for philosophy, unless the philosophy rushes toward nihilism, then nothing exists, including God. But God does exist for philosophy in as much as there is being, there is existence, there is being itself, there is the act of existence. What we mean by existence, that things exist, implies existence itself, the milieu for beings to find their being. So this is automatic for philosophy. The word God in philosophy, at least in this preamble kind of stages or this level of first reflection, God is not a being among beings. God is not in reference to the God of Islam, the God of Christianity, the God of Judaism, Hinduism, any tradition that talks about God in terms of God's revelation of some kind. For philosophy, we start with the basic concept of divinity that is identical to being itself for classical metaphysics. So, as we start here, God, by definition, is otherwise than nature. In fact, apophatically, otherwise than being. So even though we'll talk about God as being itself is one of our best ways to think about God philosophically, God, by definition, still exceeds whatever we mean by being. This doesn't make God an empty concept, but a very dynamic one. There's a difference between an empty concept and a dynamic concept. An empty concept refers to nothing there. Even the concept of nothing is dynamic. So, for philosophy, I'm not sure that there are any empty concepts because there's always some kind of signification going on. There's always some kind of meaning. And the word God, the name God, for philosophy is something filled with content, so much so that there is a via negativa in relation to the via positiva. This is a dynamic back and forth between transcendence and immanence, um, between what exceeds every concept and yet what gives itself through concepts. Both things together. So, as we think about God, we want to keep this in mind. Um, God, who utterly transcends all beings and their finite ways of being. So, this first way to think about God was Thomas Aquinas in terms of the categories of act and potency. God exists because God is the first cause of change. Nothing that changes is changed by itself, but rather is changed by something else. If something has being, it made its way into being through other beings. But the whole universe, on the whole, we have to say this about the universe itself. The universe that has its being, that's defined by change, made its way into being from an elsewhere that is not subject to change, that is not finite, that is not contingent, that is not ephemeral. So something else has to grant existence to that which did not exist. Something else that is existence itself, that is always, that is to be, that is being itself, that is what we're calling divinity, what we're calling God. Something cannot be both actually what it is and potentially what it is at the same time. So, using the metaphysical concepts of potency and act, a thing can't both have already changed and be about to make the same change at the same time. Either we have a potency awaiting to be actualized, or we have a potency already actualized. We don't have both at the same time in the same way. Otherwise, that would violate the principle of non-contradiction, which then we don't make any sense. So we make sense by virtue of these stable, steady, reliable, solid metaphysical concepts like act and potency, because what we're talking about, what we're explaining through these concepts is the very process of change, the process of becoming. What does it mean for a being to change? That's a great philosophical question. And we have to use metaphysics to answer the question. What does it mean for a being to change? Not just to say it becomes different than it was. We ask, why does it become different than it was? And when we ask why, we're inquiring into the cause of the change. That is metaphysics. All science is based on these basic first principles of reason, of logic, of intellectual coherence. We have no sense making with a sentence without the copula, is. That links subject to predicate and everything else. So, with no is, with no verb to be, no matter the language, we have no sense making. Metaphysics is the necessary foundation for any sense making. So, something cannot be both actually what it is and potentially what it is at the same time. To describe or to explain for metaphysics, um, What is change? What is becoming? It's a movement where you have a potency that a certain being could become this, could develop more according to this or that potency. So in human development, for example, from conception onward, the human organism evolves, and we have a zygote stage of development, a single-celled organism, rather spherical, no arms, legs, head, all these organs developed yet, but in potentia, they're on their way to developing. The fullness of the form is already there in the incipient moment of the being's existence. It has only to unfold, only to develop. In the case of biological organisms relying on ongoing nutrition and hydration, but those genetic cellular processes of the DNA replication, of the mitosis, the cellular division. This biologically, all animals do this. We have a progression of becoming, of change. All of these potencies gradually actualized due to prior actualized being, the parental beings involved in the reproduction of the organism, all this nutrition and hydration already in existence that's contributing to the development of this new individual organism. And so metaphysics describes the meaning of change in terms of potencies actualized. Potencies actualized. And we have cause in relation to effect. Act is the cause that brings about the effect in the being. But there's always a prior act. And we peel back the onion all the way, so to speak, to the original cause itself, not caused by anything else. And this is pure act. This is what God is. That which is subject to change cannot be the logical cause of its own existence. Change does not cause change, but simply describes the movement from cause to effect. So change isn't the cause of change. That's a tautology. It makes no sense. Change is simply a description or a definition of a process, a movement from potency to act by a prior act. This movement we call change. So I'm taking my commentary in this video from my 2019 book, Metaphysics, Basic Introduction in a Christian Key, as well as some reference along the way to my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein. But first thinking with Thomas Aquinas, who's referenced a lot in Stein's work and in this book. So thinking about what is the meaning of change in relation to the meaning of cause and effect, in relation to the meaning of act and potency. Eventually we can talk about the relation between form and matter, going back to ancient Greek philosophy. So a cause effects change, and therefore change, that is the transition from potency to actuality, is not eternal in itself, is not being itself, but depends on being itself. Depends on the stable ground of being, that is pure act with no admixture of potency. It is necessary to distinguish them between primary cause and secondary causes within this network of potency and act. Just that it is necessary to distinguish this ontological difference between being itself and beings. Being itself, existence itself, and beings who find their existence in the order of existence that precedes them. So history, when we study, for all of us, the 19th century, the 1800s, I'm pretty sure it's safe to say none of us had existence yet. None of us. And yet we talk about these times like we know these figures, we interact with their writings, and as if we're contemporaries. And in some ways we are, as we lift above the natural order of things. But in any case, we have to admit we didn't cause ourselves to exist. We have to admit that all of these finite beings come and go in the observable universe, even stars. And so, what is the stable ground of being? That is existence itself. This is what philosophy wants to think. We continue to ask the question, we continue to want to think it along with people like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and Edith Stein. So there's a distinction between the primary cause, that is being itself, that is pure act, and all of the secondary causes and beings that come and go, that are very ephemeral and transient. So if change is produced by a series of intermediate causes, we necessarily must seize upon a first primary cause that sets the series of secondary causes in motion. And this first uncaused cause, that which is pure act with no admixture of potency, that which is not subject to change itself, but produces all change and all the things that are changing, this is what is called God. A preamble of faith in divine revelation is to establish the most rational fact of divinity. It's one of the most rational facts we can have in philosophy, upon which everything else is based. So that's the first general, we could say, proof, way to understand that God exists, that God must exist, a kind of rational exigency, metaphysical exigency, ontological exigency. This must be the case, even though my finite mind cannot circumscribe what is meant by the signifier, the concept, the various words for God. But intellectually, I have to assent to the truth that because there is something rather than nothing, there always is something beyond the temporal flux that involves before and after. And this perpetual, we could say this perpetuity of being itself, is a first principle for metaphysics that we continue to confront, to wrestle with, and we can invite being to be thought in us in these ways. But we have to also assent to the saturation of the reality of the concept, which doesn't mean we don't think anything. It's only emptiness inside the shell of the concept. But it's such saturating substance that it has both positive and negative dimensions about it. Um, so, yeah, you can refer to Kant in Kant's idealism, but that's exactly what Kant is. It's a reductionism of thought to subjectivity. And if this is the way one wants to do philosophy, at least one has to come clean about the matter that we're not talking about objective reality. We might even be talking about the objectivity of subjectivity, but at some point we need to come back to the objectivity of objectivity with Husserl, with Thomas Aquinas, with Aristotle, with Edith Stein, all these different thinkers who took reality and the wholeness of reality seriously and allowed reality to give itself to them. And philosophy is receptivity and response to reality. Reality is not what I make it. This is the difference. So the second way to know that God exists with Thomas Aquinas has to do with what we would call efficient cause and effect. So he relies on Aristotle's four different kinds of cause and effect: formal cause, material cause, efficient cause, and final cause. So we're thinking along with these concepts, especially efficient causality in the second proof. And thank you for your comment. So reality is always mediated. Yes, it's always mediated. But what we're after in metaphysics is reality and not just the how reality is mediated. So yes, we want to take into account all these hermeneutical considerations, but we also want to get to the things themselves by letting those things themselves come to us. We permit them to come to us. We don't say, wait, stop the show. I will let you know who can come, what can come, when, according to my hermeneutical purview. Instead, it involves a kind of hermeneutic humiliation to get to the things themselves, to admit that there is a God and I am not God, uh, that there is a first and that is not me, that there is a first cause and it is not me or any finite creature or even the whole matrix of finite being we call the universe. So, this being said, even with reasoning from efficient causality, we can say it is rationally impossible for an effect as a potency actualized to precede its cause, to precede act itself in the realm of actual being. So it's impossible for potency to come before act in order. Potency has been actualized as such and awaits its further actualization. Act comes first, potency second. And in the ontological difference, we have the concept of pure act lighting up at the front end of everything and the ground of everything. So again, it is rationally impossible for something to cause itself efficiently. That is, for something to be its own efficient cause. For efficient cause implies a clear effect that emerges as a result of a prior cause that is different and distinct from its ensuing effect. An effected potency that has been actualized by already existent and an already actualized being. So, in other words, nothing precedes itself. It is what it is and when it is because of another before it. In the seismic chain of cause and effect, to eliminate a cause is to eliminate its effect. Yet every effect gives testimony to its cause, the cause upon which it depends for its own received existence and essence. If we find ourselves betwixt a host of intermediate causes, it stands to reason that there is a first cause, and this first efficient primary and that secondary uncaused cause goes by the name of God. So given this chain of cause and effect, seismic chain, so many causes and effects going on between finite beings, altogether we reason that we have many potencies actualized. But what is responsible for the sum total of all these actualized potencies from the beginning? So this is where Thomas Aquinas is reasoning with Aristotle. Act is prior to potency. And the Greek words are energeia, where we get the English word energy, is always prior to, comes before dunamis, where we get the English word dynamite. Um, dynamism. But first, there has to be a kinesis. There has to be act. There has to be a cause that sets in motion for there to be motion. A cause that grants being to a finite existent that had none at a certain point in time. And this is what I've argued in this book, Human and Divine Being. What I also argue in the little book, I don't have a copy on hand. It's called Metaphysics, a Basic Introduction in a Christian Key. If we take Einstein's mass energy equivalence equation, that represents the universe, the observable universe, in terms of the physical universe. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Speed of light is the constant, and it can have a numerical value theoretically of 1, and energy is equals mass. And we have these laws of thermodynamics Energy can be neither created nor destroyed, and the same for mass, because they're convertible one into the other, and this is happening all the time. The stars are shining their light. They're emitting radiant and thermal energy, light and heat, because of the process of nuclear fusion, where mass is being converted into energy. When nuclear particle accelerators, energy is introduced, and then particles are crashed on a screen and produce more particles, because energy is shown to be convertible into mass back and forth, which is to say, neither energy is eternal, nor is mass eternal, nor is the energy mass matrix eternal, because it's defined by change. And something in the process of change cannot be the cause of that same change. Therefore, we have to have a primary cause that is not part of this energy mass matrix of finite being, of being on the way of becoming, being defined by change. And this first cause is of a different order of being, and in fact is what philosophy calls being itself, existence itself. We can sense it, we can feel it, we live within it, and we have been granted a share in being from an elsewhere that we're trying to search out in philosophy, and moreover theology. And in theology, we will let this source speak for itself. But philosophy at least sets the stage, at least performs an ablatio, a process, ablatio, like a sculptor facing a block of marble, and will reveal the beautiful image therein by carving away the excess, what is in the way of seeing clearly the form. So artists, in their own way, and every kind of art, draw our attention to how all of these effects point to their cause. The effect, that is the universe, points to its cause, that is other than the universe. That all of this residue of effect, residue of finitude, points, depends on its infinite, other than finite source. So we're talking about efficient causality. Okay, so I'm trying to give some examples there. I mean, if I throw the marker across the screen, there's efficient causality. I threw it. I put it in motion. Manufacturing put this marker as such in being, but it began with the architectural form of marker, the utilitarian anticipation of how would this be used, why should we put it together. There's lots of examples of efficient causality everywhere, very obvious cause and effect relationships. But what Thomas Aquinas is saying is that because we face this world, this universe filled with secondary causes and effects, we look to the uncaused cause responsible for it all, that itself is not an effect. We have to have a cause that itself is not an effect of any other cause. This is the most logical thing to say. What else can we say? That we have the original cause of the universe is an effect of something else. Well, we're still pointing. At some point, we have to say, we have to regard this entirely different ontological order that we know something about because of the nature of the effects. And if we're understanding change as a movement from cause to effect that involves potencies being actualized, then we have to reason that on the extremities of this metaphysics are pure potency and pure act. Pure potency, this is the most empty concept there is, if there is one at all, because it's a purely theoretical concept and we don't have pure potency. Pure potency doesn't exist, because if there is a potency, it's already an actual potency. So there's no potent potency. There's no unformed matter, in other words. What we mean by matter is potency. even the periodic table of elements, that this particle of matter could participate in millions of different kinds of forms. That points to a formal causality of why is this being in the form of human? Why is that being in the form of earthworm? Why is that being in the form of maple tree? That being in the form of star, that being in the form of dolphin, that being in the form of barracuda, that being in form of iron, uh, countless forms. The variety of forms of the universe, no one has ever thought even a small fraction completely. There's so many. So philosophy is dealing with this fact, the sheer fact of the magnitude of forms of being. Okay, so we want to go to the third rational explanation of God's existence, always reasoning from the effects to the cause, with Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas admits the human mind cannot know God directly apart from the mediation of the effects. That is the universe. Everything that fills the universe makes up the universe. We can't just jump to God in thought. It is not self-evident to posit God exists. It has to be reasoned both inductively and deductively by meditating on the temporal actuality of the effects of creation. So here, the third proof that God exists. There is being and there is non-being. There is that which is and there is that which is not. Something that is capable of not being, in essence, is not. This is an important point. So what else is meant by potency? In potency involves non-being in relation to being. Potency means something is not yet in being, but could be actualized into being. So potency itself signifies the difference between being and not being, and the possibility that this difference can be crossed through a cause. So something that is capable of not being in its essence is not. So my essence is closer to nothing than to being, because for the most part of the history of the universe, I was not. And presumably, there will be a lot of history after I am not here. As far as the theological questions, what happens when a person dies, that's for another time. But in terms of observable universe, observable beings, physical universe, we want to think as what we observe. Beings come and go in their temporality. So thank you for the comment. Neoplatonists would disagree with Aristotle. Pure actuality and pure potentiality both coincide in the one. The indefinable dyad, the one are the first emanation. Yeah, so what we're doing with, if we think about the history of Greek philosophy, going back to the pre-Socratics, then through Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all the way into Neoplatonism, Plotinus in the Aeneads, for instance, as we reference, the prioritization of the one. Okay, but there's still the many. And Neoplatonism doesn't necessarily override Aristotelian hylomorphism. So what we're talking about here is yes, dealing with doctrines of hylomorphism, refusing to reduce everything to the one, and that we're convinced with Aristotle and hylomorphism that the whole is not just one, but obviously we have plurality. And we have individuality, and we have the integrity and uniqueness of individual beings, especially when it comes to persons. And therefore, we get the concept of dignity, which has a moral resonance involving personal rights and responsibilities. If everything is reducible to one, we may end up with a contemplative soup that glosses over any actual metaphysical differences between beings, glosses over the ontological difference between being itself and beings, and disintegrates the integrity of individuality of being. And this, we would say, in the Judeo-Christian tradition overall, is a categorical mistake. It's a reductionism. It's a philosophical reductionism, akin to the idealism that is played out again in Hegel in the sublation, where we have assertion, negation, sublation, a reductionism into the one, into the concept, into the idea, that we don't have polarity, we don't have difference, we don't have alterity, but we have a reductionism to homogeneity. But is that really the truth about truth? Or does truth give itself precisely as a unified plurality of being? Some of the most remarkable thinkers of the 20th century argue this through a recuperation of Aristotelian hylomorphism, definitely Thomism, and putting the ancient in conversation with the new. Eric Chavara, for example, is a very key thinker in this regard in his book, Analogia Entis. So this is what we're thinking here beyond Neoplatonism, precisely because thinking more than Neoplatonism and refusing the nearby occasion of reductionism. So to continue with this third proof of God's existence, we say, we encounter the ontological difference, again, the fundamental distinction between being itself, what Aquinas calls ipsum esse, being itself as verb. The essence of divinity is existence. And then we have beings, entia, or an individual ens, that in themselves are not by themselves, that is, are not by their own power and initiative. Because there are unnecessary beings, beings that do not have to exist, there is intrinsically necessary being, being itself that must exist for there to be beings that must not exist. This stands to reason. A being that once was not, essentially is not. And a being that will perish in its sustained individual existence for all observable standards, essentially is not. It was not, and soon it will be not. So if all observable beings in the world come and go, and therefore are essentially non-being in themselves, we could reason that in the beginning there exists non-being or nothing. Okay, so we follow this line of logic. If all observable beings in the world come and go, which is true, even of stars, even of planet Earth, it came, it will go at some point. And therefore, all of these kinds of finite transient beings are essentially non-being in themselves. They can't claim a right to be, because there was a time they were not, and there will be a time when they are not again. So they can't say, I am, on their own. No being wills itself into being. Even those that of us personal beings that experience having a will over time. We cannot will that we will not go out of being as much as we try. So all of these finite, contingent, transient beings are essentially non-being. They are not existence itself. They don't have to be. They're lucky to be, because it is good to be. But we have to reason then that in the beginning, before this temporal flux of finite beings, there exists non-being or nothing. If we want to hold the universe, the finite universe, responsible for its own existence, we have to say then the universe itself, its essence is non-being. That is a great paradox. What we think is so real, the universe and all it contains, its metaphysical essence, because it exists temporarily, defined by change, defined by flux, is not in itself being. It's becoming between act, potency, act, but essentially non-being, nothing. But this is certainly not the case with being. We can't posit in the beginning was nothing. Even the concept of nothing is always in relation to the something that obviously is. There is, after all, something rather than nothing, and therefore eternally something rather than nothing. Yet something cannot originate from absolutely nothing. Every dependent and contingent being that comes and goes in its fleeting existence depends on something else. This something else that posits, holds, and sustains every fleeting instance of being in its being, and is not itself dependent on anything else, but is absolutely necessary for everything else. This is called God. God is the necessary cause of all beings that could be, and moreover must be, inasmuch as God loves them from pure potential being, that is, they could be, to actual being, they must be in relation to God, and so they are. Um, okay, so let me refer to the comment again. Thank you for this other comment. Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, would say that Aristotle's pure act has a duality of thought. So it would be second hypostasis of the divine mind. Yeah, this is something philosophy has to come back to again and again. Humility. There is a divine mind, and it's not the mind of the philosopher. Try as the philosopher will, we can't convert our mind into a divine one. It's a finite one, it's a limited one. And I would say, I've heard lots of papers, presentations, articles, books on dualism, as if dualism is always a bad word, as if we don't want this at all costs. I don't always know what's meant by dualism, but I prefer the words plurality, diversity is great, multiplicity, polarity, otherness. If someone wants to overlay these terms with duality, I can't help it. But for my mind, a more essential concept than duality is something like otherness, the self and the other. And as a personal being, through dialectical thought, a movement of thought, a discursive reasoning from this to that and this to that, um, otherness is irreducible. It might be easier to argue that unity is irreducible or oneness is irreducible. There's a oneness about being. But also what we encounter is the irreducibility of otherness. If this were not the case, the universe wouldn't be so diverse. But what we encounter in our lived experience is incredible diversity. What we encounter in intersubjectivity and the ethical relationship, which ought to be important for us, is an irreducible otherness between the self and the other. The whole concept of the dignity of the person rests on the irreducible otherness of the other. If the other can be reduced to the same, we have no individuality, we have no uniqueness of the person, we have no integrity of being of the individual person, and ethics collapses. There's no ethics in Hegel, there's no ethics in Nietzsche, there's no ethics in Neoplatonism, or if there is any, it's a very thin one. But the thickness of ethics depends on plurality of persons in relation to the potency of unity that we would call communion. That is, the bond occurs through communication. So in philosophy, I would argue very vehemently, without becoming hyper aroused, that we have to be on guard against all reductionisms. And there's a fundamental dialectic for thoughts. And I see it in Thomas Aquinas, in Edith Stein, and Eric Chavara, and John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, Hans Urs von Balthasar. So many thinkers, mystical saints, people who are committed to social justice, like a Dorothy Day. You see a dialectic at work that thinks wide enough to allow unity and plurality to stretch thought as its bookends, as its complementary foci in an elliptical form. This is key for philosophy today, especially in a postmodern situation. So we have to realize the consequences of reductionistic philosophy. And this is where Aristotle says extremes meet. And if we're talking about, the far right or the far left of the political spectrum, for example, or we're talking about the difference between extreme fundamentalism, extreme relativism, these extremes meet in a great reductionism. So I think to keep thought alive, it proceeds just like atomic polarity, gravitational force, electromagnetism, sexual difference between male and female, where a fruit can be born precisely because of the difference, because of the otherness, because of the polarity, and yet complementarity, the vis-a-vis, the reference of one to the other that forms a unity. Because unity without plurality is, we might say, uniformity, homogeneity. Plurality without unity is division, divisiveness, fragmentation. And our postmodern situation presents both temptations equally strong. You can become a fundamentalist or you can become a relativist. You can become a staunch fundamentalist, or you can become a staunch relativist. Trying to think of other words without bringing in unhelpful adjectives that would confuse the point. But fundamentalism is saying there is a truth, I have it, game, set, match, done. And now I listen with my own mouth. Fundamentalism. Relativism, there is no stable truth, there is no objectivity. Truth is entirely psychologized, subjectivized. And then there comes the movement of nihilism. In either case, we have the temptation then of ideology where might is right and whoever's in power makes the rules and essentially fabricates the truth according to their, his or her, or the group's self-interest. And so philosophy is on guard against this. Philosophy wants to allow truth to stay in play. And for truth to move, to stay in play, it involves these poles of difference. And above all, with metaphysics, of ontological difference between being itself and beings. So thank you for the comment. Okay, so we could admit Neoplatonists have some kind of ethics of virtue. Stoicism is nearby there. But in any case, if we want a full-blown ethics, if we want to think to all the issues, not in a hegemonic way, but in a holistic, dialectical way, there we need the other. And I'm not saying there's no place for Neoplatonism or even Hegelianism or even idealism within philosophy. It's there in the history. We can't gloss over it. But we have to relate it to the philosophical other, which would be objectivity, more realism, and these things. So when I propose these tandem philosophical methods of metaphysics on one hand and phenomenology on the other, what I'm saying is combining all the forces, all these various complementary dynamisms in the history of philosophy for our present projects, our present time, our present thinking. Okay, so 2 more proofs about God's existence. And then maybe we'll have time to refer to Edith Stein. So number 4, thinking about gradations of being. So Thomas Aquinas reasons. I'm not quoting him, I'm paraphrasing, commenting. Every being that is expresses some degree of perfection in its essence. We could say perfection in the sense of fulfillment, completion, actuality. Every being that is expresses some degree of perfection of its essence. Every living being that grows and develops according to its innate entelechy, in terms of the formal and final cause of the being, which I hope to talk about later, exists somewhere along the continuum of its most perfected state of being. Embryonic forms of biological life tend toward their full development into adulthood. Intellectual life is perfected through the fertile art of education. Moral life is perfected through spiritual ascesis or discipline, and active passivity in relation to divine grace, in terms of Christian moral theology. Mystical life is perfected through the gift of contemplation and docile receptivity to divine love. All beings emerge in their individual being in relation to a fullness or plenitude of being that no being possesses on its own by itself. Even humanity means way more than the individual, but including the individual. It's the beauty of being human, is I have my place in the whole, and the whole is less without me. I'm human. What a glorious adventure I've been welcomed into in relation to the whole of humanity, and so much plurality of persons here, and diversity of beings and personalities and talents and gifts and contributions to the whole. And so this is what it's getting at, the perfection of not only an individual being, but a fullness and plenitude of being human, for example, but this whole network of being that we call creation, that no individual being possesses on its own by itself. Received individual being is rated in proportion to the fullness of being, that ipsum esse, that being itself, that is always greater than the sum of its reflective parts, the created on the creatio ex nihilo, created from nothing parts of finite beings. If something is partially good, its goodness is in relation to the fullness of that good, and above all stands in relation to uncreated goodness itself. So if there are parts, there is a whole. And the whole doesn't just transcend the parts, it includes them. This is why we can say in philosophy, we can think to the whole in as much as I was hewn from it. I come from it. I'm in reference to it. So in a sense, I have a right to reference the whole, to think toward the whole, because I'm part of it. If there are mutable degrees of perfection, there is an immutable standard of perfection. For being, creaturely beings exist always and only in relation to uncreated being itself and all fluctuating degrees of perfection. Whether in terms of truth, goodness, or beauty, the Platonic transcendentals and the unity of these all relates back to its transcendent source of transcendental perfection, namely divinity, God. Okay, yeah, so thank you for point of agreement. The concrete person, you say, has more reality than abstract forms. You sort of agree with that. Yeah, so we were confronted again by the doctrines of Aristotle's hylomorphism, again from the Greek words hule, means matter, and morphe means form. And this is how Aristotle augments, corroborates, but goes further than his teacher Plato in terms of, yes, form is important, but also matter, the abstract and the concrete, the transcendent and the immanent. And this is where Christianity gives us a more sacramental perception of things. We refuse pure abstraction and pure materialism. We refuse to be Platonic or Neoplatonic, and we refuse to be pure materialist, maybe Heraclitean or Marxian or something, Nietzschean along these lines. But we appreciate all the insights within Catholicism, all the insights where they're lighting up, where they're coming from. So we could say Nietzsche had a point, and Hegel had a point, Schopenhauer had a point, Plotinus had a point. All these philosophers have a point. Even for Catholic theology, we could say Luther had a point, and Calvin had a point, and so on. Thomas Aquinas is an exemplar thinker because he dialogues with so many different interlocutors, so many philosophical others, cultural others, religious others. He's dialoguing with who does he call the philosopher? Not a Catholic Christian, a Greek, lack of a better word, pagan, non-Christian. Aristotle, the philosopher. Uh, Maimonides, um, Averroes, Avicenna, Muslim thinkers, Jewish thinkers, non-Christian thinkers, ancient Greek philosophy. Thomas Aquinas is very cosmopolitan in his thought. And I'm convinced that the more cosmopolitan we can be in our thinking, the better we understand the cosmos. The cosmos in relation to the polis. Just to think cosmopolitan, we embrace the whole. And we especially encounter the whole like Socrates preferred the city to the countryside, because here we're confronted with so many more parts of the whole. And we're not maybe tempted to as much abstraction because so much concrete that thought has to deal with. And so the similar thing is true for Thomas Aquinas. He's reasoning on the gradations of being, the various approximations of the fullness or perfection of this or that essence of being. And altogether, the perfection is required across the complementarity of beings. We think of our humanity, for example, and as many talents as each one of us has, and we could say assets of one kind or another, the fullness of humanity depends on all of us. And that each one of us recognizes there's something I contribute to the whole that no one else does. Maria Montessori reflected about this, and she talked about each individual person has a cosmic task. Each individual person has been ordained, appointed, sent on mission for a cosmic task. And that cosmic task has a vital role to play within this cosmos. So to think in a cosmopolitan way is to commit to thinking toward the whole without letting up. The fifth proof then of the existence of God, why God must exist as first cause and as final destination and judge of all that exists. Aquinas talks about intelligence and final cause. So we've talked about efficient causality in terms of this intermediate sequence of cause and effect that points to the first cause, the formal cause of all forms and material reference to the forms. And then we also think about divinity in terms of final cause, in terms of teleology. So even if we're thinking about biological evolution, biological organisms evolve with purpose. But what sets that purpose out in front, upon which the evolution itself depends? Something places it there. Something draws the creature to devolve in this or that direction. And we can talk about environmental factors, but okay, there's an interdependency between environment and individual being as a part of that environment. And so what puts the whole orchestrated symphony of being in motion? Who is the choreographer of all the dancing, of all the interacting of beings, of all the evolving, of all the developing? There's something driving the process on the front end and also the back ends. So this has more to do with the back end, what a creature is moving toward intelligence, and final cause. So the final rational proof of Thomas' 5 compelling reasons why God as such exists points to authority, rule, sovereignty, intelligence, and the inherent governance of all things. So several concepts going on there. If we experience authority, rule, sovereignty, intelligence, governance in our lives, what is the impetus of this phenomenon of authority, phenomenon of governance, and to do so with intelligence? This coherence where, and we especially experience this in a democratic setting. I think in some ways that would go missing in other structures of government, but just that there has to be some rationality, some intelligence at work to make claims, to formulate arguments, to persuade people, even within a majority rule kind of thing. And of course, the flip side, the shadow side of all this is ideology can then rule instead of coherent reasoning. But in any case, we still have coherent reasoning, and we're trying to do so with Thomas Aquinas here. Final causality, what Aristotle calls final causality, is instrumental in revealing the origin of ends and the relationship between origin and end. This is very important. In this realm of becoming, is to say there is a whence and a whither. There is a from and a to. This much is certain. There is a from, and being toward. And there is an otherness. There is an elsewhere that is behind the from and out in front of the toward, the to. And as finite beings are trying to move, gather momentum from toward. Origin of ends, teleology, what's called teleology in this metaphysics, from the Greek word telos, that means end, goal, purpose, and also logos, the ratio, the reason, the science, the knowledge about this end, goal, purpose. Teleology. So teleology defines the way of being of the universe. All things act toward predetermined ends. There's predetermined ends for action, even for involuntary growth and development of biological organisms, of what's going on with these processes of nuclear fusion with stars, with gravitational force. There's a teleology that must have been established in advance for this cosmic choreography to take place, to unfold, to continue to be actualized, all these potencies to be actualized. So today we call these the immutable laws of nature, fundamental forces of nature, the laws of thermodynamics, conservation within physics and natural science. When non-intelligent beings act intelligently, this proves intelligent being behind them. What we call instinct in animals, how did it get there? What put it there? What do we identify as the cause? And if someone says evolution, that does not define a cause. It simply describes a process. But what is the cause? Philosophy begs the cause of the evolution, the reason for the change, the impetus for the becoming. Philosophy goes the distance and asks why, not just what, not just how, in certain finite terms of natural science, material and efficient causality, but asking why, all the way to why something rather than nothing. What is the nature of this something that always is? That must be the basis, the ground, the cause of all of these somethings that most of the time we're not. The essence of their being is non-being because they exist for a time. So when non-intelligent beings act intelligently, this proves intelligent being behind them. The very word intelligence, from the Latin inter, legere, to choose, select, gather, read, or speak between or among. Intelligence is the very definition of rational thought. Inasmuch as we are speaking, thinking, gathering up, choosing the truth from falsehood, not because we make it so, but because we choose wisely based on its self-revelation. But this between, what we call intelligence, what is it between? The elsewhere, that is the from which I am, and the elsewhere, which is the toward which I am, the formal and final cause of my being. This is the very definition of rational thought, to think between these and from them and to them. The personal spiritual subjectivity that turns and faces every object in acts of knowledge, as well as the iconic face-to-face relationship of love and responsibility between personal subjects. So this is another definition of divinity here. Getting toward that pure personal spiritual subjectivity, even through the analogy of being, that turns and faces everything in the universe. But what we experience as we turn and face things, as we turn and face matter, which says we're more than matter, we talk about it, we think about it. There's something going on in our being that transcends Newtonian matter in motion, that transcends the periodic table of elements and subatomic particles, that transcends our neurochemistry, our neurobiology, our physiology and anatomy altogether. What we call the spiritual soul, what we call personhood, what we call subjectivity, that which is the most essential substance of our being, around which the material body comes and goes. And so a person maintains an individuality and a personhood over the course of time because the spiritual core remains the same and steadfast in its being. If involuntary beings, mass energy in general, act toward definite goals, purposes, or ends, it is not because they choose to do so. So what is the intelligence, again, that's responsible for the orchestration, the choreography of involuntary and non-intelligent beings? What's responsible for these so-called laws of nature, for the fundamental forces of nature, for this progression of cause to effect? It's begging, our questions are begging the cause responsible for all of this. The rationale for acting in consistent ways must be determined in advance for change to have stable, repetitive, productive, and meaningful direction. So we experience like our moral life is based on intelligence and intelligibility of being, to choose the good and do the good rather than its lack we call evil. Further, for personal spiritual beings, we strive toward desirable ends of action called goods. And the greatest good we might identify as happiness, for example. Eudaimonia in the work of Aristotle, beatitudino in Latin, and Thomas Aquinas. So morality, this word from the Greek maestai, to strive or to master oneself, is the field of study that evaluates human acts and their corresponding sources of motivation. If I do something, it is because I am motivated, moved by a perceived end of action to do so. So I have a motive for acting, and the motivation, the internal motivation, is related to the perceived external end of action. The one who directs all natural beings to their given ends and who is the point of reference as goodness itself for all moral acts is God. So this last proof involves a final causality, intelligibility, intelligence, authority, sovereignty, governance, perfectibility of being, and also the perfection of the moral life. All that is meant by this perfection of being, this fulfillment of being, this fullness of being, is involved in this fifth proof for the existence of God in the work of Thomas Aquinas. So just one more proof coming from the work of Edith Stein, again taking especially from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein, and my little 2019 book, Metaphysics, a basic introduction and a Christian key. So this is where the commentary is coming from. Edith Stein talks about the person, the human person experiences himself or herself as received being. I have been received into being in this sense. So in addition to Thomas Aquinas' 5 rational demonstrations of the existence of God, we can add one more contribution inspired by the writings of Edith Stein. Stein's insight about the finite ego, the ego eimi in Greek, the I am, ego sum in Latin, in relation to the eternal ego, the eternal ego sum of God, brings together concepts of phenomenology with the potency act hermeneutic of metaphysics. So in the last section of chapter 2 of her book, Finite and Eternal Being, Edith Stein writes a persuasive testimony to the existence of God based on the reflection of our fleeting subjective life we call consciousness, or the ego life. So as a person, I can say I am. I do not merely exist, but am mindful of the existence that I am, and that others, especially other personal egos, are. So I have this conscious awareness that I exist as an individual being, that others exist as individual beings. And thank you for your comment. Yes, Thomas Aquinas, as I mentioned earlier in this live stream, was very much informed by authorities of the Islamic Golden Age, Averroes, Avicenna, for example, and that the philosophy of Aristotle that Thomas Aquinas is relying on so heavily in his work came from the Arabian philosophers. It made its way into Europe, into the universities through the Muslim scholars. So this is true, and this is why I say Thomas Aquinas thinks in a cosmopolitan way, because he's willing to dialogue with everyone in his thinking toward the whole, and it's very beautiful. It's very exemplar. So thinking then with Edith Stein, who also thinks to the whole in her own way in a more contemporary time than Aquinas, bringing together contemporary phenomenology and classical metaphysics, she's reflecting on the ego life. And as a person, I can say I'm consciously aware of my own personal individual existence and that of other persons and other individual beings. At the same time, I'm acutely aware that I am not. I certainly am not yet. And the no longer that I call my past is no longer present. So I experience my ego life as a constant, I could say, a wave, a flux between no longer and not yet. What we call the present is so such a small instant of conscious experience, and so often we're not thinking about it. We take it for granted, and we just live as we should, and not be too preoccupied with a philosophical meditation on selfhood, to the point that we can't act, we can't live into the whole anymore, because we concentrate so much on the analysis of the self. And then there's all these neurotic consequences that follow. So narcissism has its problems. Uh, so we think about the person that I am. At the same time, I'm acutely aware that I am not. There was a time I was not, and a time is coming when I will not be what I am as I am right now. Also, I am not yet what I will be. This much is clear to personal conscious life. Nevertheless, I am. I assert my actual existence as a person in the universe, and this is a miraculous thing. How is it that I am? Why am I? So, um, nevertheless, I am. I am a radically transient being, and without a doubt, I am not being itself. My being is essentially received being. I receive my being from an elsewhere that is not identical to myself. Nevertheless, I am. My being, my I am, is a received I am. The nature of my subjectivity, my selfhood, is received from an elsewhere. I've received my being by being, not of my own will. I've been received into being. I receive my own being in reflecting upon it. I receive my selfhood when I say I am. I'm not asserting something eternal about myself, in myself, but as I reflect on my I am reflects the eternal I am we call God, we call divinity. Because by myself, I am nothing, but from the divine I am, and because of the divine I am, I am. Divine I am, ego sum, ego eimi, is actual, is perfectly actual, is in act, in toto, completely. I am is divinity. But by myself, I'm nothing. The divine I am is actual, and my I am has been actualized. I did not posit my own existence out of nothing, nor do I sustain it over and against nothing. Someone else punctuated me into being and sustains my being at every moment. It's a miracle to take another breath, for the heart to beat another beat, to think another thought, to wake up to another day. Everything is given. It's miraculous. If we really ponder our metaphysical being, this is the truth about it. So it becomes quite humorous to ask, does God exist? Because the more immediate question is, do I exist? And why is it that I exist? And when I ask, why do I exist? This is what Edith Stein is saying. It's getting at God right away, the reason for my being. And again, I'm a person. I experience selfhood, individuality, uniqueness. I'm caught up in this dramatics of love. Yes, I desire to be loved, and I have this capacity, um, uh, this capax Dei, to love and to be loved. I have this capacity to have something to do with God because it stands to reason, much more than not, that God had something to do with me, and so I am. That divinity must be personal. This is why it's entirely unsatisfactory to claim that the universe is eternal. The impersonal universe is eternal. Are stars personal? Not at all. Are planets, mute planets, personal? Not at all. We have this miracle happening on this speck of the universe we call planet Earth, where there's life, and not only life, but personhood. and not only personhood, but personal history, and not only personal history, but salvation history that has something to do with God, and that God has something to do with humanity. If God were not personal, I could not say I am. So to say I am is evidence for eternal I am, that I am not, but must be, for me to be, I am. So with reference to St. Thomas Aquinas' fourth proof of the existence of God, the ego life is more akin to the plenitude of divine being in comparison with impersonal beings, because its presence lasts in relation to a much greater dissipation of being than that of its own. The ego, being a self, is a miracle in this um, uh, rapidly fluctuating universe. To be an I am for more than an hour, a day, a year, a decade, to be I am for this much time is a miracle. How? Why can I be a self in spite of this rapid change? In spite of all these forces that seem to want to disintegrate my body, why can I still say I am? And to be able to contemplate this miracle, I am, between the no longer and the not yet, at every instant, at every moment. This is wonderful. And this, yes, supernaturality of the self, supernaturality of personhood. We think the supernatural is something other than person. No, the person is already bound up in the supernatural, because personhood exceeds the natural order of things. Personhood defies even more than animal instinct, even more than propagation of species and reproduction of species. The ego life, personhood, defies the natural entropic decline of the cosmos proceeding to a disorder, chaos. Why is there cosmos in spite of the threat of chaos? This is the miracle that is brought about by divinity. So, with reference to Thomas Aquinas' fourth proof for the existence of God, we have this miracle of personhood, of selfhood, the presence of the person that lasts in relation to a much greater dissipation of being than that of its own. Just so it's like we have the privilege of observing entropy take place, and we get to observe it over and against it. The I am of the self is in a constant rebellion against the rebellion of chaos, against the cosmos, that it desires to disintegrate. So the very theological meaning of original sin and fall has to do with something, something of a compromise within the cosmos to invite chaos into it. And we reflect on this in relation to the laws of thermodynamics. If work is not put into a system, it will naturally proceed to chaos. And this is called entropy, cosmic disintegration toward a state of thermal equilibrium, which is very, very cold, rather homogeneous atomic frozen soup. Disintegration. And so the I am, the ego life, is in the middle of this rebellion of the cosmos becoming chaos, and rebels against it by pronouncing I am. Okay, so the ego life, just as God subsists as the immutable personal stability of the instability of creation, The ego life in the imago Dei, the image of God, subsists as stable conscious agency, all the while the contents of consciousness remain in rapid flux. This too is miraculous, that we have all these perceptions constantly that run through consciousness, but there's something stable about consciousness that receives them all, processes them all, interprets them all, synthesizes them all, integrates them all, and finds meaning, finds constellations of meaning lighting up. This is a miracle of being a self. And then we have, moreover, the ethical relationship between self and other, that has its own meaningful vocations about it. So the heart of the imago Dei is detected here. Affinity for the infinity of being, that plenitude of personal being we call love. And this love is revealed as that what Edith Stein calls sheltering hold of my own being, my I am. That despite of its radical transience, myself, my personhood is sustained and held in its being from moment to moment like a child in her mother's arms. So even as an adult, when I reflect on this philosophically, I sense both through phenomenological givenness and signification, but also through metaphysical deduction and kind of these things combining forces, not merging into one through a Hegelian sublation, but dialoguing. I sense that there's a sheltering hold about my own being that permits me to be a little bit longer. My I am, that despite of its radical transient, is sustained and held in its being from moment to moment, just like a child in her mother's arms. And because each one of us used to be that child in his or her mother's arms, and she cared for us, or the father cared for us, someone cared for us, or multiple people cared for us, here we are today at this stage of life, able to ask these questions and pursue the truth about them. Because my being is held in being by another, non-identical to the being that is my own, I am. The one who holds me alone cannot not be. This is the great paradox of being itself. It has no choice. Divinity has no choice but to be. And because of this non-choice of being itself, we get to make all these choices about our being. And it stands to reason that the more we choose what is good, the more we allow our being to be perfected by the good. So that's the moral questions there. The one who holds me alone cannot not be. However, it is possible for me not to be. In fact, there was once again a time, most of the time, when I was not. What I am becoming, I do not entirely know. If there is received being, there must be given being. Being given, the cause of all beginning. Divine being. So again, this is from my 2019 book called Metaphysics. If you want to read more, just taking quite a bit of commentary from that book in this live stream today. So the cause that we are identifying here with divinity, we say in theology, the great I am, or the necessary I am for there to be, the finite I am. This cause also, we reason, must be one. Because if it were many, one deity would lack qualities that another deity possessed, and vice versa. And the one and only deity, that is, as being itself, cannot be divided into multiple beings themselves. For who would hold the being of the other in its mutually contingent being? So polytheism doesn't make sense philosophically. Philosophy helps us to get back to this ethical monotheism that is there with Judaism in the ancient world, that we see extensions in Islam and Christianity, and all great world religions in their own ways have a share in these these cosmological truths about being, different forms of religious expression. Theology still will wonder what is true concerning God's revelation, and what reasons do we have adjudicating between what is adequate or inadequate, authentic, inauthentic, true or false concerning divine revelation. But for now, all we're trying to do is establish the accomplished fact that God exists, that God must exist. And it's exciting to ask this question, to lean into it, to come across all of this rational demonstration proving God does exist. Not like I prove that this object is here in my hand, but an intellectual proof in terms of an alternative is lacking in rationality. So it's most reasonable to surrender. It's essentially, that's what believing in God involves, a surrender to the intellectual exigencies that necessitate uh, these philosophical necessities that bring us to the truth, the fact that God exists, rather than the illusion, the lie that God does not exist. It is one or the other, for sure. We have the principle of non-contradiction. Fortunately, at least this principle is as self-evident as self-evidence gets. But the existence of God, again, to say with Thomas Aquinas, is not self-evident in itself, because the nature even of the concept of divinity, it saturates thought. It's not a mediating requisite to connect a subject to a predicate. But the question of God concerns not only the ultimate in terms of nomination, in terms of subject connected to all predicates, but in terms of the verbal act of being that makes all finite subjects and predication possible. There must be this. For philosophy, we think all the way to the whole. And maybe I finish this point and I answer this question just posed about the Egyptian monotheistic pharaoh. So polytheism does not make sense for philosophy, because then we have finite deities. Once we have two, we have limitation in terms of individuality and corporeality and uh, mutual dependency. But God must be one. So this is true. In Christianity, we don't only have the oneness of God, we have the plurality of persons that together comprise the singularity of divine substance. Now, that is the stuff of theology, which is beyond the scope of philosophy. But philosophy still can reason about the reasonableness of divine revelation, of God as one, but also as a trinity of persons, which we can go there. But let me just finish this point and I'll get to this question in the chat. So it is possible, and in fact must be actual, that there would be a personal multiplicity in this eternal unified ego life that is the Trinitarian personal substance of being itself. So this is a short argument for the Christian understanding of God as one divine substance, yet a trinity of persons at the same time. Because if God does not have plurality, if God does not have personhood, how could we say God is love? Who would there be to love if there was only one solitary lover with no one else to love? So I am because we are, therefore I am, to quote the African proverb, which is really a spin on the Cartesian cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Very individualistic, solitary, ego, seeking epistemological certainty. But when we're asking the question of God's existence, it is something, as Jean-Luc Marion talks about, more of an assurance for thought, the assurance of otherness, of the elsewhere, of alterity, that there's always more loving to be done, that I always can decide again to love, and things like this. So to reflect with Edith Stein on the ego life, and on the miracle of the finite I am, points to the eternal I am, that is the personal God. Okay, so thank you for the comments. So thinking about an Egyptian monotheistic pharaoh, Akhenaten, and the Zoroastrian deity Ahura Mazda, do I think these cultures extended such ideas to Jews, to the Jewish people, Jewish faith? My read of history, I have some other videos on YouTube, a playlist or a podcast entitled Covenant and Commandments. And here I talk about the ancient world and what's very unique about the Jewish people in terms of the Torah, the Mosaic law and prescriptions, how it's quite different than the Code of Hammurabi, for example, and other things going on in Egypt. But I think Zoroastrianism certainly is a precursor to Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, for sure. And Muhammad was recapturing that monotheistic intuition that there already is with Zoroaster, and concentrating it even more with then codified in the Quran and all the surahs of the Quran. So I think what we see is some commonality across cultures in the ancient world, and in general, what we can describe happening in the ancient world, going back to the beginning of humanity, thinking about those Genesis texts in the Hebrew scriptures, we have monotheism in view. And with original sin, we have a fall, an ontological degradation of being across creation, which already is anticipated by the fall of the angels. And we have the voice of the tempter that tempts humanity in the same direction, which happens. They follow suit. And we have original sin. And then we have this confusion about God. And, in the Hebrew scriptures, the essence of the original sin was to be like God, but it's a misinterpretation of what is it to be like God. And then to start to become an arbitrator as to what is good, what is evil, to make our own laws up as we go. But what's unique about Judaism is that they're looking to God as the author of the legislation. The whole meaning of the Ten Commandments, the divine finger writing on the tablets of stone, is to bring about this return to the ethical monotheism through Torah, through the teaching, the law, the instruction. The way back to God, who has a sacred name, not just abstract first cause, if we're getting into theology, but a sacred name that's so sacred that Jewish people don't say it to this day. I don't either. But we would say the Lord instead. But what happens throughout human history is a constant fall from, a decline from, a lapse from monotheism, all the way to polytheism. And maybe atheism is its own version of, something like atheism in relation to monotheism, in relation to not even asking the question of God anymore. There's a fall in the truth about God, that is the oneness of God, monotheos, one God, And the movement all the way down to polytheism proceeds through henotheism. In the ancient world, we see this. In contemporary times, we see this in different ways. But heno, from also meaning one in Greek, we have the one God among many deities among the pantheon with henotheism. We have, but one is like higher than the rest, like a Zeus in Greek mythology, something like that. I think, as you mentioned, Ahura Mazda in the ancient worlds, there's a movement back to monotheism, but a lot of times going back through henotheism to get there. So we get a lot of biblical texts talking about the divine beings, and it's a kind of implied henotheistic context. But polytheism is kind of an equality of the pantheon. Henotheism, we have one God above the rest, but still many divine beings. In monotheism, we only have one God. And this is the fundamental credo of Judaism, Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5. The Hebrew, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, Echad. Echad. So getting back to the Echad of God, and it's this God, the creator of the heaven and the earth, but we have a distortion of an understanding of God and an approach to God, the polytheism, the self taking the place of God, and all these things going on. So Judaism is representing this vocation of all humanity back to monotheistic faith. I think, and for the sake of comparative theology, yes, we think about the three great Abrahamic religions as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in that chronological order, at least, but they share this ethical monotheism, at least the heritage, the history. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing these thoughts in the chat. I always appreciate the comments, the questions, and with all of this, yeah, we start to get into comparative theology, and it's very interesting. And so we do the historical heavy lifting to get at what's going on in the ancient world. And comparative theology helps to get at this. When we do a comparative analysis of the different legal codes of all these different ancient people groups, we see a lot of variety. We see some similarities, but some definite differences, especially with, I would say, Jewish Torah. So I did a series again. It's called Covenant and Commandments on my YouTube channel. You can check that out for more about the research I did into these questions. So thank you. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to entertain them at this time. This video on the question of the existence of God with reference to the work of Thomas Aquinas and Edith Stein. Yeah, as far as ancient history, we have a lot of artifacts to sift through and think about. But in terms, I think philosophy can help us even approach this ancient history. Again, this kind of concept, what's going on in the ancient world across cultures. This would be some general markers to help interpret what's going on. And again, this return to radical, ethical monotheism. To what degree do we see that in the cultural, archaeological, textual evidence in different people groups in the ancient world? We can do a comparative analysis. So, very good. I thank you all for joining me in this live stream. It's been a great pleasure to be with you. I really appreciate your presence. If you're not a subscriber, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and to get updated. I try to do live streams Monday through Friday for about an hour and a half a day, sometimes a little longer like this one. And let me know in the comments what Good to see you. What other topics you might like to explore? What are your favorite kind of topics I'm dealing with? And then we can keep the discussion going. So may we all continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.